I'm filing for divorce. I've met someone else." The words echoed through the private dining room of Le Bernardin, where we were celebrating our 20th anniversary. My husband, James, stood with a champagne flute in his hand, smiling at our stunned guests, our closest friends, his business partners, and my tearful sister. What he didn't know was that his beloved 1967 Shelby GT500, the car he loved more than anything in this world, had been sold 3 days earlier for $215,000. The money was already in my private account. I simply smiled back at him and raised my glass. "To new beginnings," I said. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The evening had started like any other celebration in our 2 decades of marriage. James had insisted on booking the exclusive private dining room at Le Bernardin, New York's premier seafood restaurant. 20 years deserves something unforgettable. He'd said 3 months ago when making the reservation. How prophetic those words would turn out to be. I had arrived early to ensure everything was perfect. The flower arrangements of white roses and blue hydrangeas, my favorites, not his. The placement cards written in elegant calligraphy, the vintage champagne already breathing. 2 decades of hosting events as James Rothwell's wife had trained me well in the art of flawless presentation. The maitre d' had complimented my dress, a fitted midnight blue gown that I'd purchased specifically for this occasion. "You look radiant, Mrs. Rothwell," he said. If only he knew the real reason for my glow. As our 30 guests arrived, a carefully curated collection of people who had witnessed our journey from ambitious young professionals to established Manhattan power couple, I played my role perfectly, greeting each person warmly, accepting congratulations on reaching this milestone, laughing at reminiscences of our early days together. I was the consummate hostess, the devoted wife, the woman who had seemingly built her entire identity around supporting her husband's meteoric rise in investment banking. James arrived last, of course. He always timed his entrances for maximum impact. At 48, he still turned heads, silver threading through his dark hair in exactly the right places, his bespoke Tom Ford suit emphasizing his athletic build, his smile practiced to convey both confidence and charm. I watched him work the room, moving from group to group with calculated precision, his hand occasionally touching a shoulder here, a forearm there. The performance of intimacy without its substance, a skill he had mastered over the years. When he finally made his way to me, he kissed my cheek and whispered, "You've outdone yourself, Alexandra." Not Alex, as he'd called me when we first met at Columbia Business School, when we were equals with matching ambitions and dreams. Somewhere along the way, I had become Alexandra, elegant, poised, and increasingly ornamental in his life. "Only the best for 20 years together," I replied, maintaining my smile while meeting his eyes directly. Had I not been watching so carefully these past months, I might have missed it. That momentary flicker of something like guilt, quickly replaced by his usual self-assurance. But I had been watching, cataloging every subtle change in his behavior, every unexplained absence, every password change on his devices, every unusual movement in our financial accounts. Dinner proceeded according to plan. The 7-course tasting menu was exquisite, the wine pairings impeccable. Conversation flowed easily among our guests. Discussions of recent vacations, children's achievements, market predictions, and reminiscences of shared experiences. On the surface, it was the perfect celebration of a successful marriage. As dessert was being served, a delicate vanilla bean soufflé with raspberry coulis, James stood and tapped his spoon against his champagne flute. The room quieted, anticipating the traditional anniversary toast. I took a slow, deep breath, centering myself for what I knew was coming. "Friends, family, thank you all for being here tonight," James began, his voice carrying that practiced resonance that had closed countless million-dollar deals. 20 years ago, Alexandra and I stood before many of you and promised to build a life together. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on me. I kept my expression neutral. My posture relaxed. Let him have his moment, I thought. Let him believe he's in control of this narrative. We've had an incredible journey, he continued. Built successful careers, traveled the world, created a beautiful home, shared countless memories with all of you. Another pause. I watched. Our guests' expressions, the soft smiles, the slightly misty eyes of the romantics among them. They were all playing their expected parts in this scene, unaware that the script was about to change dramatically. But life evolves. People grow, sometimes in different directions. I saw my sister Elena's smile falter first. She had always been more perceptive than most, more attuned to the undercurrents of relationships. Her eyes darted to me, questioning, concerned. Alexandra and I have reached a point where we want different things, James said, his voice taking on that sympathetic tone he used when letting someone down gently. I'm filing for divorce. I've met someone else, someone who shares my vision for the next chapter of my life. The collective intake of breath was audible. Shock registered on every face. All eyes turned to me, expecting tears, anger, humiliation. My sister half rose from her seat, ready to come to my side. But I simply smiled and raised my glass. To new beginnings, I said clearly, my voice steady and calm. Confusion replaced shock in the eyes watching me. This wasn't the script they expected. The wronged wife should be falling apart, not offering toasts. James faltered for the first time, his practiced poise cracking slightly. This wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. He had expected to control this moment completely, to appear reasonable and regretful while I provided the emotional counterpoint of anger or despair. My calmness disrupted his narrative. You're taking this well, he managed, trying to regain his footing. Did you expect otherwise? I asked, my tone conversational, as though we were discussing a minor change of dinner plans rather than the end of our marriage. Please, continue. I believe you were telling everyone about your new vision. Elena's confusion was giving way to something like admiration as she slowly sat back down. My brother-in-law David was struggling to suppress a smile. They didn't know the full story yet, but they sensed that something unexpected was unfolding. James cleared his throat. Yes, well, I've accepted a position leading the new Singapore office. Melissa, my colleague from the London branch, and I will be relocating next month to establish our presence in the Asian markets. Melissa. Finally, the mystery woman had a name. The woman whose perfume I had first detected on his shirts 6 months ago. The woman he had been visiting during those essential London meetings that always seemed to fall on weekends. The woman whose name appeared repeatedly in text messages I had discovered when James had left his phone unlocked while showering. Congratulations on the Singapore position, I said. It's an incredible opportunity. This much was true. James had been campaigning for an international leadership role for years. The Singapore office would offer him exactly the visibility and prestige he craved. He nodded, clearly thrown by my composure but trying to maintain control of the situation. I wanted to be transparent with everyone. Alexandra and I have discussed this privately, of course. This blatant lie was his first major mistake of the evening. We had discussed nothing. Every plan had been made behind my back, every decision reached without my knowledge, every detail arranged to present me with a fait accompli. He assumed that by announcing our divorce publicly, he would force my acquiescence to his terms. Transparency is important, I agreed, my smile never wavering. Which is why I should probably mention that I've made some changes as well. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Changes? I nodded, taking a deliberate sip of champagne before continuing. I've been reevaluating my priorities too, starting with our assets. The atmosphere in the room shifted again. Our friends, many of them lawyers, financial advisors, or executives, themselves recognized the implications of my statement immediately. This wasn't just about emotional fallout anymore. I was signaling something about financial consequences. "Alexandra," James said, his tone carrying a warning note now. "This isn't the time or place for those discussions." "I agree completely," I said, "which is why I'm confused about your choice of venue for announcing our divorce. But since we're here, and since you've opted for transparency with our closest friends, I thought they might be interested to know that I've sold the Shelby." The reaction was immediate. James's face drained of color. "You what?" The 1967 Shelby GT500 had been James's obsession for the past decade. He had spent 3 years tracking down one with the exact specifications he wanted, another 2 years restoring it to pristine condition, and countless weekends attending car shows and collector events. He often joked that if our apartment caught fire, he would save the documents for the Shelby before anything else. "I sold it," I repeated calmly, "to a collector in California. He's been pursuing it for years, as you know. He offered $215,000, which I thought was fair given the current market." "You had no right," James said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "That car is mine." "Actually, it was registered in both our names," I corrected him. "A decision you made for insurance purposes, if you recall. Legally, I had every right." The room had gone completely silent. Our guests were witnessing something few people ever see. The moment when a carefully constructed facade crumbles completely, revealing the raw reality beneath. "When?" he demanded. "I completed the sale 3 days ago," I said. "The funds have already cleared. I've established a separate account for my portion of our joint assets, starting with the proceeds from the Shelby." James set his champagne, flute down with such force that the stem snapped, sending glass and champagne across the pristine white tablecloth. "This is theft," he hissed. "It's asset division," I corrected. "Something that happens in divorces. You're familiar with the concept, surely, given how meticulously you've been planning your exit strategy for the past 6 months." His eyes widened fractionally, confirmation that my timeline was accurate. What he didn't know was exactly how much I had discovered, how thoroughly I had documented his deception, or how carefully I had prepared my response. I turned to our guests, many of whom were now staring at their plates or glasses, uncomfortable witnesses to the unraveling of our carefully constructed social image. "I apologize for the dramatic turn this evening has taken," I said. "This wasn't how I plan to celebrate 20 years of marriage either. Please enjoy the remainder of your dessert. The soufflé is exceptional." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With that, I stood, smoothed the skirt of my gown, and walked deliberately to where my sister sat. I leaned down and kissed her cheek. "I'll call you tomorrow," I whispered. "Everything is under control." Elena squeezed my hand, her eyes reflecting both concern and pride. "I'm here whenever you need me." I walked toward the exit with measured steps, maintaining perfect posture, the poise that had been drilled into me since childhood serving me well in this moment. I could feel every eye in the room on my back, could almost hear the thoughts racing through their minds. Poor Alexandra. How humiliating. How is she so calm? What did she mean about asset division? James caught up with me just outside the private dining room, grabbing my elbow and pulling me toward a quiet alcove in the restaurant's main corridor. "Have you lost your mind?" he demanded, his voice low but intense. "The Shelby? My car?" I looked pointedly at his hand on my arm until he released me. "I thought you'd be pleased," I said. "It saves you the trouble of figuring out how to ship." It to Singapore. I wasn't taking it to Singapore, he snapped. I was going to keep it in storage here. Along with me? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Another possession to be maintained but not engaged with? His expression shifted from anger to calculation, the look I had seen countless times when he was reassessing a negotiating position. Alexandra, be reasonable. We can handle this like adults. There's no need for vindictive actions. Vindictive? I repeated. Is that how you characterize my financial decisions? Interesting choice of words from someone who has been systematically transferring funds to private accounts for months. He couldn't fully hide his shock. What are you talking about? Cayman National Bank, I said simply. The account you opened last November, the one you've been moving approximately $15,000 into each month since then. Did you think I wouldn't notice? James prided himself on his poker face, but 2 decades together had taught me to read the subtle tells. The slight tightening around his eyes confirmed my suspicion that there were other accounts I hadn't yet discovered. We should discuss this with our lawyers present, he said, retreating to formality. I agree completely, I replied. I've already retained Patricia Goldstein. You remember her, I'm sure. She represented Eliza Bennett in her divorce from William Bennett last year. William ended up with considerably less than he expected, as I recall. Patricia had actually been my friend since our undergraduate days at Wellesley, long before she became one of New York's most formidable divorce attorneys. She had been my first call when I discovered James's deception months ago. James's jaw tightened. This isn't going to go the way you think, Alexandra. I've built safeguards you can't possibly understand. Perhaps, I acknowledged. But I've had 6 months to prepare while you thought I was completely in the dark. Don't underestimate what I've learned about our finances during that time. For 20 years, I had played the role of supportive wife, organizing our social calendar, maintaining our homes, entertaining his clients and colleagues. I had subsumed my own career aspirations to facilitate his rise through the ranks of investment banking. I had been the perfect corporate wife, always impeccably dressed, unfailingly gracious, intellectually engaging without ever overshadowing him. What James had forgotten, or perhaps never fully appreciated, was that before I became Mrs. Rothwell, I had been Alexandra Vega, summa cum laude graduate in finance, with job offers from 3 top firms. I had been his equal, his competitor, before I became his wife. And while I had set aside my professional ambitions, I had never lost my analytical mind or my attention to detail. You've made a serious mistake, James said finally. One you'll regret. I smiled, genuinely this time. No, James. For the first time in years, I've made a decision that's entirely my own, and it feels remarkably good. With that, I turned and walked through the main dining room toward the restaurant's entrance. I could feel the curious glances of other diners, attracted by the tension emanating from our exchange. The maitre d' appeared at my side. Is everything all right, Mrs. Rothwell? Can I call you a car? Everything is fine, I assured him. And yes, a car would be appreciated, but it's Ms. Vega now. Alexandra Vega. Outside, in the cool April evening, I took my first deep breath in hours. The weight I had been carrying for months, the suspicion, the investigation, the careful planning, shifted slightly. It wasn't gone, not yet. The most challenging parts of extracting myself from 20 years of marriage still lay ahead. But I had taken control of the narrative. I had refused to be blindsided or victimized. My phone buzzed with incoming messages, friends from the dinner expressing concern, offering support, asking questions. I silenced it without reading them. Tomorrow would be time enough for explanations. Tonight was for something else entirely. The car the restaurant had called pulled up to the curb. As I settled into the back seat, the driver asked, "Where to, ma'am?" I gave him the address of the boutique hotel where I had reserved a suite 3 days earlier, the same day I had finalized the sale of the Shelby. My luggage was already there, containing carefully selected items from our apartment: financial documents, family heirlooms, irreplaceable photographs. The essentials for beginning again. 20 East 76th Street, I said. The Surrey Hotel. As the car pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse of James emerging from the restaurant, his expression thunderous as he scanned the street. He didn't see me behind the tinted windows of the departing vehicle. I didn't look back again. My focus was entirely forward now, on the path I was creating for myself, one deliberate step at a time. The first phase of my plan had unfolded exactly as intended. James had believed he was orchestrating a public humiliation. Instead, he had provided the perfect stage for me to declare my independence. The next phases would be more complex, requiring all the strategic thinking and emotional resilience I could muster. But tonight had confirmed what I had begun to suspect months ago when I first discovered James's betrayal. I was stronger than I had allowed myself to believe, more capable, more resilient. My name is Alexandra Vega. I am 46 years old, and tonight is the first night of my new life. The Surrey Hotel embodied discreet luxury, precisely what I needed for this transitional phase of my life. As I entered my suite, the contrast with our Central Park West apartment was striking. Here, everything was elegant but minimal, lacking the overabundance of possessions that had accumulated through 2 decades of marriage. The simplicity felt clarifying rather than austere. I kicked off my heels and poured myself a glass of water, resisting the temptation of the minibar. I needed absolute clarity for what came next. Standing by the window overlooking Madison Avenue, I watched late-night pedestrians hurrying through the April chill, their lives continuing uninterrupted while mine underwent seismic restructuring. My phone had been buzzing continuously since I left the restaurant. 27 missed calls, 43 text messages. James, Elena, friends from dinner, even our doorman letting me know that James had returned to the apartment in quite a state. I silenced them all except for 2. Patricia Goldstein, my attorney and oldest friend, and Dr. Lillian Chen, my therapist for the past 6 months. To Patricia, I sent a brief text. Phase 1 complete. Meeting tomorrow at 9? Her response came immediately. My office. Bring everything. Proud of you. I had been meticulously preparing for this moment since the day I found the first concrete evidence of James's affair 6 months ago. The Cayman account had been the beginning, an irregularity in our financial statements that most spouses might have overlooked. But I had been handling our personal finances throughout our marriage, maintaining detailed records that James had long since stopped reviewing. The monthly transfers of $15,000 had stood out immediately. Instead of confronting him, I had begun investigating. It wasn't just financial intuition driving me, but emotional recognition as well. James's behavior had been shifting subtly for nearly a year. More frequent business trips, new passwords on his devices, diminishing physical intimacy, increased criticism of small things I did or said. Each change was minor in isolation, but significant in aggregate. My discovery of the Cayman account had transformed vague unease into focused inquiry. I had hired a forensic accountant recommended by Patricia, giving her access to every financial record I could legally obtain. I had documented James's schedule, cross-referencing his supposed business meetings with flight records and credit card charges. I had even, in a moment of both determination and heartbreak, hired a private investigator to follow him during a critical London conference that conveniently fell on our anniversary weekend 3 months ago. The photographs the investigator had sent me showed James and a woman I now knew was Melissa Carter entering and leaving a boutique hotel in Mayfair. They weren't being particularly discreet, holding hands, stopping to kiss on street corners, dining at visible tables in upscale restaurants. He hadn't expected anyone to be watching. He had assumed I was safely contained in New York, maintaining our home, managing our social calendar, preserving the foundations of his success while he planned his escape. But I had been far from passive. Each piece of evidence had been carefully cataloged and shared with Patricia, who had helped me develop a comprehensive strategy. We had identified all accounts, properties, and investments, paying particular attention to those James had attempted to obscure. We had documented the timeline of his affair and his financial maneuvers. We had prepared divorce papers that would be filed first thing tomorrow morning. The Shelby had been an unexpected opportunity. James had left the title in both our names, for insurance purposes years ago, never imagining I would act independently regarding his prized possession. When a collector who had been pursuing the car for years contacted James again last month, I had intercepted the email and responded, myself. The ensuing negotiation and sale had been conducted entirely without James's knowledge, the proceeds deposited into an account he couldn't access. It wasn't about the money. The $215,000 was insignificant compared to our overall assets. It was about reclaiming agency, making a decisive move that would allow me to set the terms of engagement, rather than merely reacting to James's plans. It was also, I could admit to myself now, about ensuring he felt a fraction of the loss and betrayal I had experienced. My phone rang, interrupting my reflections. Lillian Chen, right on schedule for our prearranged check-in. You did it, she said when I answered. Not a question, but a statement of acknowledgement. I did, I confirmed, feeling both exhaustion and exhilaration wash over me now that I was alone with someone who knew the full context of tonight's events. How do you feel? Lillian asked, her voice calm and grounding as always. I considered the question carefully, scanning my body and mind for an honest answer. Lighter, I said finally. Like I've set down something I've been carrying for months, but also alert, ready for what comes next. That makes sense, Lillian affirmed. You've moved from discovery and preparation into active engagement. Your nervous system is responding appropriately. For 6 months, Lillian had been helping me process the complex emotions that had emerged with each new discovery about James's deception. She had created space for me to acknowledge grief, rage, and fear without becoming defined by these responses. She had supported my strategic planning while ensuring I remained connected to my deeper values rather than acting purely from hurt. James was shocked, I told her. He didn't expect me to know anything, let alone to have already taken action. People who engage in deception often project their own lack of awareness onto others, Lillian observed. They assume their partners are as uninformed as they've tried to keep them. He's angry about the Shelby, I continued. More angry about that than about me knowing about Melissa or the Cayman account. Objects often become repositories of identity and control, especially for men raised in certain cultural contexts, Lillian said. The car represented something beyond its material value. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. It was his most visible status symbol, the thing that connected him to a specific community of collectors and enthusiasts, a world separate from both his professional identity and his marriage. And now that independent sphere has been disrupted, Lillian noted, which likely intensifies his sense of lost control. I moved to the bed and sat down, suddenly aware of the day's accumulated fatigue. He told everyone at dinner that we had discussed the divorce privately, that it was something we had reached together. A narrative that cast him as reasonable and forthright rather than deceptive, Lillian observed. Exactly. He wanted to control how others perceived the end of our marriage, to position himself as the mature party making a difficult but necessary transition. Which speaks to his priorities, Lillian said, maintaining a favorable public image rather than addressing the relationship honestly. This insight crystallized, something I had been sensing throughout our marriage but had never fully articulated. James valued perception over authenticity. The appearance of success, happiness, and integrity had always mattered more to him than their actual achievement. Our marriage had been, in many ways, a carefully curated exhibition rather than a genuine partnership. "What happens now?" Lillian asked after a moment of silence. "Patricia files the divorce papers tomorrow morning. We'll request an emergency hearing for temporary orders regarding asset division and access. The forensic accountant's report will be submitted as evidence of James's attempts to hide assets." "I meant for you," Lillian clarified gently. "Beyond the legal proceedings. What happens for Alexandra now?" The question caught me off guard. For months, my focus had been on uncovering James's deception and preparing my response. I had thought extensively about legal strategies, financial protections, and even tonight's public revelation. But I had given surprisingly little thought to what would follow, to what I actually wanted for myself beyond ensuring I wasn't victimized by James's betrayal. "I don't know," I admitted. "I haven't planned that far ahead." "That's perfectly natural," Lillian assured me. "You've been in strategic response mode. Now you're entering a space where new choices become possible." New choices. The concept felt simultaneously liberating and disorienting. For 20 years, my choices had been made within the context of my marriage, my identity as James Rothwell's wife informing every decision from career moves to social engagements to personal style. Who was Alexandra Vega without that defining framework? "I should get some rest," I said, the day's emotional intensity finally catching up with me. "Tomorrow will be demanding." "Take good care of yourself," Lillian advised. "Stay connected to your body. Notice when you need rest, nourishment, movement. Basic self-care becomes crucial during major transitions." After ending the call, I performed my evening routine mechanically, removing makeup, brushing teeth, changing into the silk pajamas I had packed in my carefully prepared exit bag. As I slipped between the hotel's Egyptian cotton sheets, I realized this was the first night in over 20 years I would sleep completely alone, without even the distant sounds of another person moving through shared space. The thought brought neither loneliness nor relief, but rather a profound sense of neutrality, a blank canvas awaiting new brushstrokes. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning arrived with harsh clarity. Sunlight streamed through curtains I had forgotten to close, and my phone displayed 52 missed calls and over 60 text messages. James had apparently spent much of the night alternating between threats and pleas, his messages evolving from angry accusations to wounded appeals for conversation to coldly worded legal warnings. I skimmed them while ordering room service coffee, extracting relevant information without absorbing the emotional content. He had contacted his attorney, Marcus Fitzgerald, a corporate lawyer with limited family law experience. He had discovered the Shelby transaction details and was threatening to report it as fraudulent. He had returned to our apartment to find I had removed personal items and was demanding to know where I was staying. None of this was unexpected. Patricia and I had anticipated his likely reactions and prepared accordingly. The Shelby sale was completely legal given the joint title. My removal of personal possessions was well within reasonable parameters for separation. My location was irrelevant to any legal proceedings and would remain private for my own security. I forwarded the most explicitly threatening messages to Patricia, then showered and dressed in the outfit I had selected specifically for today, a charcoal gray pantsuit that conveyed professional competence rather than the softer, more feminine aesthetic James had always preferred. My wedding and engagement rings remained in the hotel safe. In their place, I wore my grandmother's sapphire ring, a family heirloom that predated my marriage and symbolized a heritage independent of the Rothwell name. At precisely 8:30, I left the hotel and walked the few blocks to Patricia's office, on East 72nd Street. The morning air was brisk but invigorating, carrying the promise of spring despite the lingering chill. I moved with purpose, taking note of details I normally overlooked, the intricate stonework on the buildings I passed, The varied expressions of pedestrians navigating their morning routines, the resilient green of early plants emerging in tree, beds along the sidewalk. Patricia's office occupied the second floor of a renovated brownstone. Unlike the glossy midtown firms with their intimidating lobbies and identical conference rooms, her space felt more like an elegant residence. Comfortable seating, warm lighting, art by female artists on every wall. The setting put clients at ease while subtly communicating that this was a place where women's experiences were centered and respected. Patricia herself embodied this same balance of approachability and formidable competence. At 50, she had the confident presence of someone who had spent decades refining her expertise. Her silver-streaked dark hair was cut in a precise bob, her outfit impeccably tailored but not ostentatious. She greeted me with a warm embrace rather than a handshake. "You look stronger already," she observed, leading me to her private office where coffee and pastries awaited. "How are you holding up?" "I'm surprised by how calm I feel," I admitted, accepting the coffee she offered. "I expected more emotional turbulence after last night." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "You've been processing this betrayal for 6 months. Last night wasn't the beginning of this journey for you. It was a pivotal moment in a process already well underway. James doesn't see it that way. He thinks I've suddenly lost my mind and am acting out of vindictive impulse." "Which works. To our advantage," Patricia noted, switching seamlessly from friend to legal strategist. "His underestimation of your preparation gives us tactical leverage." For the next 2 hours, we reviewed the comprehensive documentation I had gathered and finalized the petition for divorce that would be filed that morning. The grounds were straightforward: irretrievable breakdown due to adultery and financial misconduct. The temporary orders we sought were extensive: freezing of all joint accounts, prohibition against disposal of assets, exclusive use of our apartment, since James had clearly been planning to relocate anyway, and comprehensive financial disclosure. "What about support?" Patricia asked as we approached the end of our review. I had given this considerable thought. Despite putting my own career ambitions on hold to support James's advancement, I had maintained certain professional activities throughout our marriage, serving on non-profit boards, managing investments, occasionally consulting on financial matters for friends' businesses. These activities had kept my skills current while fitting within the constraints of my role as corporate wife. "I don't want ongoing support," I decided. "I want a clean division of assets and complete independence going forward." Patricia studied me carefully. "You're entitled to significant support given the length of the marriage and your contributions to James's career advancement. Waiving that claim reduces our negotiating leverage." "I understand," I acknowledged, "but I don't want any arrangement that requires ongoing connection or gives James any sense that I remain dependent on him." After further discussion, we reached a compromise. We would include a substantial support claim in the initial filing to establish negotiating position, with the understanding that I might ultimately exchange this for other considerations in the final settlement. As Patricia's assistant prepared to take the filing to the courthouse, a new message appeared on my phone. This one from Elena, my sister. "James showed up at my door this morning demanding to know where you are. David told him to leave or we'd call police. He's unraveling, Alex. Please tell me you're safe and have good legal protection." I showed the message to Patricia, who immediately shifted our plans. "We need to request a restraining order," she said firmly. "His behavior is escalating in concerning ways." "That seems excessive," I protested, still processing the implications of James appearing at my sister's home. "He's angry and trying to regain control, but I don't think he's dangerous." "People in his position sometimes become unpredictable when their carefully constructed narratives collapse," Patricia countered. "Better to have legal protection in place and not need it than face a situation where you wish you had it." The restraining order was added to our filing, along with Elena's account of James's morning visit. By noon, all documents had been submitted to the court, and we had confirmation of an emergency hearing scheduled for the following day. As we concluded our meeting, Patricia fixed me with a direct gaze. "This is just the beginning," she warned. "James has significant resources and connections. He'll likely escalate before he accepts the new reality." "I'm prepared," I assured her, though a flicker of anxiety passed through me at the thought of what that escalation might entail. "Practically, yes," Patricia acknowledged. "But emotionally, this is the point where many clients find themselves struggling most. The initial adrenaline fades, and the full weight of what's happening settles in." Her concern was valid. Throughout my marriage, I had developed considerable skill at managing emotions, moderating my responses to maintain harmony, adjusting my expectations to accommodate James's priorities, presenting a composed facade regardless of internal turbulence. These abilities had served me well during the discovery and planning phases of the past 6 months. But they might become limitations if they prevented me from fully processing what I was experiencing now. "I'll continue working with Lillian," I promised, "and I'll be honest with myself about how I'm really doing." Patricia seemed satisfied with this commitment. As we said goodbye, she held my shoulders and looked directly into my eyes. "You're doing something extraordinary, Alex. Not just protecting yourself legally, but reclaiming your autonomy after years of gradual erosion. That's worth acknowledging." Her words stayed with me as I left her office and walked through the Upper East Side streets, considering my next steps. I wasn't ready to contact friends or respond to the barrage of messages still accumulating on my phone. I needed space to center myself before engaging with others' reactions and questions. Central Park beckoned, its emerging spring greenery, offering a neutral territory where I could be anonymous among tourists and locals enjoying the improving weather. I found an unoccupied bench near the conservatory water and sat, watching model sailboats glide across the pond while children raced around its perimeter. For the first time since discovering James's betrayal, I allowed myself to consider the question Lillian had posed: what happens for Alexandra now? The immediate future was mapped out: legal proceedings, practical arrangements for separate living, inevitable social fallout as our divorce became public knowledge beyond last night's dinner guests. But beyond these necessities lay uncharted territory. At 46, I had the opportunity and challenge of reconstructing my life according to my own design rather than accommodating someone else's vision. What did I actually want? The question was simultaneously basic and profound. In focusing on what I didn't want, to be betrayed, deceived, discarded, I had given insufficient thought to what I affirmatively desired for myself. Financial independence was clear. The forensic accountant had confirmed that, even with an equitable division of marital assets, I would have substantial resources. But money was merely a tool, not a purpose. Professional engagement seemed important. My abbreviated career before marriage had shown promise, and my ongoing involvement with investments and nonprofit governance had kept certain skills current. But did I want to attempt re-entry into traditional financial services after a 20-year hiatus? Or pursue something entirely different? My phone vibrated with an incoming call. James again, his 7th attempt today. I declined it without hesitation, but the interruption focused my thoughts on a more immediate question. Where would I actually live going forward? Our Central Park West apartment had never fully felt like mine, despite my having selected every piece of furniture, every artwork, every design element. The space had been curated to project a specific image rather than to reflect authentic preferences or facilitate genuine comfort. While I had legal grounds to claim it in the divorce, I found myself unexpectedly ambivalent about doing so. Similarly, our Hampton house, though nominally a retreat, had primarily functioned as a venue for strategic entertaining, a stage for performing the role of successful couple rather than a place of true relaxation or rejuvenation. The realization crystallized suddenly. I wanted spaces that reflected who I was becoming rather than preserving who I had been expected to be. New environments uncontaminated by pretense or performance. As this clarity emerged, another call lit up my phone, this time from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would let unknown calls go to voicemail, but something prompted me to answer. Alexandra Vega speaking, I said, using my reclaimed name deliberately. Ms. Vega, this is Detective E. Michael Ramirez with the NYPD, a deep voice responded. I'm calling regarding an incident at your residence on Central Park West. My heart rate accelerated immediately. What kind of incident? There was a disturbance reported by building security, the detective explained. Your husband was attempting to remove artwork and other valuables from the apartment. When security personnel intervened based on the building manager's instructions, the situation escalated. The building manager, Antonio, had been subtly supportive when I had explained my situation days earlier. He had promised to alert security if James attempted to remove anything beyond personal clothing and toiletries, a precaution I had considered excessive at the time. Is anyone hurt? I asked, already standing and gathering my belongings. No injuries, Detective Ramirez assured me. But several valuable items were damaged in the confrontation. Your husband is currently at the precinct. Given the pending legal proceedings you've initiated, we wanted to contact you directly rather than having this play out through attorneys. I thanked the detective for his call and promised to come to the precinct immediately. As I flagged a taxi on Fifth Avenue, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Once again heading toward a confrontation I hadn't anticipated, but for which I was nonetheless prepared. The James Rothwell I had known for 20 years was controlled, calculated, meticulous about his public image. The man who had created a scene in our building significant enough to warrant police involvement was operating from a very different emotional landscape, one defined by desperation rather than strategy. His carefully constructed narrative was unraveling faster than he could adjust, and his responses were becoming increasingly reactive rather than deliberate. In the taxi heading downtown, I realized that something fundamental had shifted since last night. I was no longer responding to James's agenda or timeline. I wasn't scrambling to catch up with his plans or deceptions. For the first time in years, perhaps in our entire relationship, I was setting the terms of engagement. This awareness didn't bring vindictive satisfaction, but rather a profound sense of reclamation. Whatever happened at the precinct, whatever legal battles lay ahead, whatever social or emotional challenges emerged in the coming months, I was moving through them as Alexandra Vega, a woman rediscovering her own authority, capacity, and direction. After years of progressive diminishment, the process wouldn't be linear or simple. Today's incident at the apartment was likely just the first of many complications. But I was no longer navigating these complexities as an auxiliary character in someone else's story. I was the protagonist of my own unfolding narrative, one defined not by betrayal and response, but by authentic renewal and self-determined growth. The 17th Precinct on East 51st Street was a stark contrast to the refined settings where I typically encountered James. Fluorescent lights cast an unflattering pallor over everything, the hard plastic chairs in the waiting area designed for functionality rather than comfort. The space hummed with a particular energy, part bureaucratic efficiency, part contained chaos. Detective Ramirez met me at the front desk, a stocky man in his 50s with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Ms. Vega, he said, extending his hand. Thank you for coming so quickly. I appreciate your call, I replied, maintaining the composed exterior that had become second nature. What exactly happened at our apartment? He led me to a small room off the main area, more private than the open waiting space, but still unmistakably part of a police station. According to building security, Mr. Rothwell arrived around noon, agitated and demanding access. When the doorman called up to confirm, as is standard procedure, Mr. Rothwell became increasingly upset, saying it was his home and he didn't need permission to enter. I nodded. This aligned with James's typical response to any perceived challenge, to his authority. The doorman allowed him up but alerted the building manager as you had apparently requested. Mr. Rothwell proceeded to your apartment and began removing artwork from the walls and collecting smaller valuables, primarily items, that security described as museum-quality pieces. The pieces in question were likely the pre-Columbian artifacts and contemporary Latin American art we had collected over the years, pieces that James had initially dismissed as too ethnic for our home, but had later embraced when they began, appreciating significantly in value and drawing admiration from his colleagues. When security personnel informed him that removal of valuables had been flagged as requiring dual authorization, Mr. Rothwell became... Detective Ramirez consulted. His notes, verbally aggressive and physically intimidating, though no actual assault occurred. He looked up from his notes. In the altercation that followed, several items were damaged. A security guard called 911 when Mr. Rothwell refused to leave or calm down. Officers responded and brought him here to defuse the situation. Is he being charged with anything? I asked, processing this information with an odd sense of detachment, as though hearing about a stranger rather than the man I'd been married to for 2 decades. That depends partly on you, Detective Ramirez said. There's potential for criminal mischief charges given the property damage, but since it's marital property and you have pending legal proceedings, we're proceeding cautiously. The responding officers primarily wanted to prevent escalation. I considered my options carefully. Pressing charges could provide additional leverage in divorce proceedings, but it would also escalate tensions significantly and potentially damage James's professional reputation irreparably. While I was determined to protect myself, I had no desire to destroy him. I don't want to press charges at this time, I decided, but I would like the incident documented for the pending divorce case. Detective Ramirez nodded, seeming to approve of this measured response. We'll provide a detailed incident report. The building's security cameras captured most of what occurred, so the documentation is quite thorough. Is James still here? I asked. Yes. We've allowed him to make several calls, presumably to his attorney. He's not under arrest, but we suggested he remain until the situation could be resolved appropriately. May I speak with him? The detective studied me carefully, perhaps assessing whether this request was wise. That's possible, but I'd recommend having legal counsel present given the circumstances. I understand your concern, I acknowledged, but I believe a direct conversation might help de-escalate the situation. I'm not interested in inflammatory exchanges, only in establishing clear boundaries going forward. After further discussion, Detective Ramirez agreed to arrange a meeting in an interview room with the provision that an officer would remain present and that either party could terminate the conversation at any point. As I waited for James to be brought in, I took a bye-bye moment to center myself. This would be our first face-to-face conversation since the anniversary dinner, since his public announcement and my surprising response. I needed to remain focused on practical matters rather than being drawn into emotional dynamics. When James entered, I was struck by how disheveled he appeared. His typically immaculate appearance was markedly disrupted. His shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. He had clearly come directly from our anniversary dinner to Elena's home to the apartment, without returning to wherever he had been staying with Melissa. His expression cycled rapidly between anger, surprise, and something like relief when he saw me. Before he could speak, I held up my hand slightly, a gesture requesting that he listen first. I've declined to press charges, I said calmly, but I need you to understand that your actions today have been documented and will be considered in our legal proceedings. James sat heavily in the chair across from me, the metal table between us a tangible representation of our new adversarial relationship. You had no right to instruct building security to prevent me from accessing my own home, he said. But the usual authoritative edge was missing from his voice. I have every right to protect marital assets during divorce proceedings, I corrected. Him. Especially after discovering your systematic movement of funds to hidden accounts over the past 6 months. His eyes narrowed. How much do you know? Everything, I said simply. The Cayman account, the Singapore preparations that began long before you received any formal offer, the property you've been looking at with Melissa since December. Each specific detail hit its mark. James had always prided himself on strategic thinking, on being several steps ahead of everyone around him. The realization that I had been tracking his movements and decisions for months clearly disturbed him at a fundamental level. You've been spying on me, he accused, attempting to reclaim moral high ground. I've been protecting myself, I countered. After 20 years of marriage, I recognize the signs of your disengagement. Rather than confronting you immediately, I chose to gather information first. It's what you would have done. This last observation seemed to land particularly hard. James and I had always shared certain qualities: analytical thinking, strategic planning, emotional containment. He had appreciated these traits in me early in our relationship, often commenting that he valued my ability to approach situations logically rather than reactively. Yet, over time, he had increasingly expected me to direct these capacities solely towards supporting his objectives rather than pursuing my own. "What do you want, Alexandra?" he asked finally, fatigue evident in his voice. "An equitable division of our assets, based on full financial disclosure," I replied. "Respect for the legal process without further incidents like today's. And recognition that our marriage is irretrievably over, which means focusing on practical dissolution rather than emotional manipulation." James studied me with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated countless negotiating partners over the years. "You've changed," he said finally. "I've reclaimed aspects of myself that became submerged in our marriage," I corrected. "There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression, a reluctant acknowledgement perhaps, or simply fatigue. "The Shelby was unnecessary," he said, returning to what clearly remained a significant emotional trigger for him. "Perhaps," I conceded, "but it was instructive. Your reaction to its loss revealed much about your priorities." "It was mine," he insisted. "It was titled to both of us," I reminded him. "Just like our art collection, our investments, our properties. We built our life together, James. You don't get to unilaterally decide what parts belong exclusively to you now that you've chosen to end our marriage." This fundamental principle, that marital assets belonged equally to both partners regardless of who earned the income or made specific purchases, had never been fully embraced by James despite his ostensible modernity in other areas. He had always maintained subtle distinctions between his and ours, particularly regarding items of personal significance like the Shelby. "What about the apartment?" he asked, shifting to practical concerns. "I need to collect my belongings." "That can be arranged through our attorneys," I said. "A scheduled time with a neutral third party present to inventory what's removed. I have no interest in your personal items, James. I just want to ensure that shared assets remain intact. Until formal division." He nodded slowly, the practicality of this approach apparently registering. "And where are you staying?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. "Elena wouldn't tell me." "I prefer to keep that private for now," I said. "Our communications should go through Patricia and Marcus until things stabilize." James flinched slightly at this formal boundary. Despite his betrayal, despite his plans to leave, he seemed genuinely unsettled by my self-protective measures, as though he had expected to maintain some form of access or connection even as he pursued his new life with Melissa. "There's an emergency hearing tomorrow," I informed him. "Patricia has been in contact with Marcus about the details. I expect you'll want to be there." "I'll be there," he confirmed, a hint of his usual confidence returning. This won't go entirely your way, Alexandra. I've built contingencies you don't know about. I met his gaze steadily. I'm sure you believe that, James, but underestimating me hasn't worked well for you so far. With that, I stood, signaling the end of our conversation. Detective Ramirez, who had been observing silently from the corner, stepped forward. Do we have an understanding about the apartment, Mr. Rothwell? No further unauthorized removal attempts? James straightened his posture, some of his customary dignity reasserting itself. That won't be necessary, Detective. Ms. Vega and I will handle matters through proper legal channels going forward. His use of my maiden name, acknowledging my reclaimed identity rather than referring to me as my wife or Mrs. Rothwell, registered as a small but significant recognition of our changed status. As I left the precinct, the afternoon sun had broken through earlier clouds, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I checked my phone to find a text from Patricia confirming receipt of the police incident report, which would be submitted as additional evidence at tomorrow's hearing. She had also forwarded a message from Marcus requesting a continuance, which she had denied given the emergency nature of our filing and James's demonstrated volatility regarding marital assets. The legal machinery was in motion now, proceeding, according to established protocols rather than personal whims. There was comfort in this structure, in knowing that regardless of James's connections or resources, certain foundational principles would govern the dissolution of our marriage. I decided to walk back toward the hotel, needing physical movement to process the day's developments. The 20-block journey would take me through parts of the city I rarely visited during my marriage, when our movements had been largely confined to established patterns, from our Upper West Side apartment to midtown offices to specific restaurants, and cultural venues deemed appropriate for James's professional image. As I walked, I found myself noticing details of the city with fresh perspective. Architectural elements I'd never registered, small businesses with interesting window displays, the varied rhythms of different neighborhoods. I stopped at a cafe I'd never have chosen during my marriage, ordered a coffee preparation James would have dismissed as pretentious, and sat at a sidewalk table observing the flow of pedestrians with no schedule pressing upon me. This simple act, selecting a cafe based solely on personal preference, with no consideration for how it might be perceived by others, felt surprisingly significant. How many small choices had I deferred or modified over the years to accommodate James's preferences? How had those accumulated adjustments gradually reshaped my sense of self until his perceptions became the primary lens through which I viewed my own experience? My phone rang, interrupting these reflections. Elena, calling for the 4th time today. I'm fine, I said immediately upon answering. I should have called earlier, but things have been developing rapidly. Alex, Elena's voice conveyed equal parts relief and exasperation. You can't just disappear after what happened last night, and then James showing up here this morning like a madman, and now David says there was some incident at your apartment involving the police? News travels fast, I observed, unsurprised that Elena had already heard about the precinct situation. Her husband David's law firm handled corporate work for several major Manhattan real estate management companies, including the one that operated our building. Are you safe? Where are you staying? Do you need to come here? The questions tumbled, out in rapid succession, Elena's protective instincts in full force. I'm staying somewhere secure, I assured her. I've met with Patricia, filed all the necessary legal papers, and just spoke with James at the precinct. Things are proceeding as well as can be expected. As well as can be expected? Elena echoed incredulously. Alex, your husband announced he was leaving you for another woman at your anniversary dinner. You revealed you'd sold his precious car, and now he's having meltdowns significant enough to involve law enforcement. None of this is proceeding as expected in any normal universe. Despite everything, I found myself smiling at my sister's characteristic directness. Elena had always been the more expressive of us, the one who spoke her mind without the filters. I had internalized from our mother's emphasis on decorum and our father's focus on strategic thinking. We had taken different paths, she pursuing a career in documentary filmmaking that prioritized authenticity over security, I choosing the more conservative route of business school, followed by marriage to a promising young executive. Yet through all the years and divergent choices, our connection had remained a constant foundation. You're right, I acknowledged. It's been an extraordinary 24 hours, but I'm managing, Elena. Better than I might have expected. The weird thing is I believe you, she said after a pause. You sounded different last night at the restaurant, stronger somehow, and seeing you handle James so calmly. She trailed off, then added, You've been preparing for this, haven't you? This wasn't a shock to you at all. I explained the discoveries of the past 6 months, the careful documentation and planning, the strategic decisions made with Patricia's guidance. As I articulated this journey aloud for the first time, the progression from suspicion to investigation to preparation, I recognized my own transformation more clearly. I wish you'd told me sooner, Elena said when I finished. You didn't have to carry this alone. I needed to process it in my own way, I explained. And honestly, I wasn't sure what I would do with the information at first. Confronting James immediately might have felt satisfying, but would have given him time to hide assets more effectively. Taking time to investigate fully gave me options. That's my sister, Elena said, a note of pride in her voice. Always the chess player, thinking 5 moves ahead. 3 moves at least, I amended, smiling again. So what happens now? Elena asked. Besides the legal proceedings, I mean, what do you want for yourself? It was the same question Lillian had posed, now coming from my sister. The fact that I still didn't have a clear answer troubled me slightly. Had I become so focused on responding to James's betrayal that I'd neglected to consider my own affirmative desires? I'm not entirely sure yet, I admitted. The immediate priorities are establishing financial independence and creating separation. Beyond that, I'm still figuring it out. That's okay, you know, Elena said gently. You've been half of James and Alexandra for 20 years. It makes sense that you'd need time to rediscover who Alexandra is on her own. Her permission to exist in this transitional space without having everything figured out felt like a gift, one I hadn't realized I needed until she offered it. In both my family of origin and my marriage, uncertainty had always been treated as a weakness to be overcome rather than a natural part of growth or transition. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow? I asked impulsively. After the court hearing. I'd like to tell you more about everything, and maybe talk through some of these questions about what comes next. Absolutely, Elena agreed immediately. Just tell me when and where. As we finalized plans, I felt a subtle shift in my emotional landscape, a sense of expansion rather than contraction. While my marriage was ending, other connections remained intact and could potentially grow stronger now that they no longer needed to accommodate James's preferences or expectations. After ending the call with Elena, I continued my walk back to the hotel, taking a deliberately indirect route through neighborhoods I rarely visited. The physical journey mirrored my internal one, moving away from familiar but constraining patterns toward unexplored possibilities. By the time I reached the Surrey, the day was fading into early evening. I stopped at the front desk to extend my reservation indefinitely, a small declaration of my intention to remain in this transitional space until I determined my next concrete steps. In my suite, I reviewed the files Patricia had prepared for tomorrow's hearing, focusing particularly on the financial documentation that would form the foundation of our case for emergency orders. The forensic accountant had done remarkable work tracing James's attempts to shield assets, creating clear timelines that demonstrated his preparations had begun long before any legitimate business opportunity in Singapore had materialized. This evidence would be compelling to any judge, regardless of what connections James might attempt to leverage. The methodical, deliberate nature of his financial maneuvers contradicted any claim that our separation was a recent development or mutual decision. The transfers to the Cayman account alone established a pattern of deception spanning months. As I reviewed these materials, I recognized that my professional background had served me well throughout this process. The skills I had developed before marriage and maintained in limited ways during it, analytical thinking, financial acumen, strategic planning, had allowed me to protect myself when James assumed I would be blindsided and vulnerable. What might those same skills accomplish if directed toward my own objectives rather than responsive protection? What could Alexandra Vega create or achieve when not functioning as an auxiliary to someone else's ambitions? The questions energized rather than overwhelmed me. For the first time since discovering James's betrayal, I found myself thinking beyond the immediate crisis toward genuine possibilities. Not just what I was leaving, but what I might be moving toward. I ordered room service rather than venturing out again, suddenly aware of accumulated fatigue after the intensity of the past 24 hours. As I ate, I made notes about immediate practical concerns, accounts that needed to be established in my name alone, personal items still at the apartment that I would want retrieved, professional contacts I should reconnect with independently of James. These concrete tasks grounded me, providing structure for the days ahead without requiring immediate answers to the larger questions about my future direction. I could move forward pragmatically while allowing deeper clarity to emerge gradually. After dinner, I prepared for the next day's court appearance with the same attention to detail I had once given to preparing for important social events in my role as James's wife. The outfit I selected, a navy suit with subtle architectural lines, conveyed seriousness without severity. My grandmother's sapphire ring would again replace my wedding set, a visible symbol of my connection to a heritage independent of the Rothwell name. As I completed these preparations, my phone chimed with an incoming email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read simply, "We need to talk." The message was from Melissa Carter, James's colleague, his affair partner, the woman he had planned to follow to Singapore. My first instinct was to delete it unread, to maintain the boundary I had established of communicating only through attorneys. But curiosity prevailed. What could she possibly have to say to me? The email was brief and surprisingly direct. Alexandra, I'm aware this contact is inappropriate given the circumstances. However, there are aspects of this situation you should know about that won't emerge through legal channels. James has not been truthful with either of us. I've returned to London and will not be proceeding to Singapore. If you're willing to speak, I can be reached at this email or the number below. Melissa Carter. I read the message twice, considering its implications. Melissa had apparently abandoned their shared plans, returning to London rather than continuing to Singapore as James had announced so confidently at our anniversary dinner. Something had clearly changed, something significant enough to disrupt whatever narrative he had constructed for their future together. Whether to respond was not an immediate decision. Any communication with Melissa carried potential complications, both emotional and legal. Yet her claim that James had been dishonest with both of us resonated with my growing understanding of his capacity for compartmentalized deception. I saved the email without replying, adding it to the constellation of information I was gathering about the actual reality beneath the carefully maintained appearances of my marriage. The full picture was still emerging, each new piece revealing how extensively James had been operating in ways counter to his presented identity. Tomorrow's court hearing would establish initial legal parameters, creating protective boundaries, while longer-term processes unfolded. But beyond those formal proceedings lay a more personal journey, one of disentangling my sense of self from the roles and expectations that had defined me for 2 decades, of rediscovering dormant aspects of my identity, of constructing a life based on authentic choices rather than accommodative responses. As I prepared for sleep, I realized that despite the upheaval of the past 24 hours, or perhaps because of it, I felt more genuinely present in my own experience than I had in years. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was unmistakably mine to determine. My name is Alexandra Vega. I am 46 years old, and I am authoring my own story now. The New York County Courthouse stood imposingly on Center Street, its neoclassical columns and grand staircase projecting permanence and authority. As I climbed those steps the morning after my precinct encounter with James, I felt a curious blend of apprehension and certainty. Legal proceedings had never been part of my life, yet entering this arena felt strangely familiar, as though my years of analyzing risk and navigating complex financial transactions had prepared me for precisely this moment. Patricia met me at the entrance, her burgundy suit and confident stride immediately distinguishable among the crowds moving through security. "Ready?" she asked, her tone conveying both support and professional focus. "Completely," I confirmed, straightening my shoulders beneath my navy jacket. Inside, we navigated the building's labyrinthine corridors until reaching the assigned courtroom. James and Marcus were already seated at the respondents' table, both in nearly identical charcoal suits, the uniform of Manhattan finance and law. James's appearance had been restored to its usual immaculate state, any trace of yesterday's dishevelment erased. Image management had always been one of his particular talents. His eyes tracked me as I moved through the room to join Patricia at our table. I felt the weight of his gaze but didn't acknowledge it, focusing instead on organizing our materials and centering myself for the proceedings ahead. Judge Gloria Ramirez entered promptly at 9 o'clock, her brisk efficiency immediately setting the tone for the hearing. In her mid-60s with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a severe bun, she radiated the particular authority of someone who had seen every possible human drama unfold in her courtroom and remained unimpressed by theatrical displays or manipulative tactics. "We're here on the matter of Rothwell versus Rothwell," she noted, scanning the filed documents. "Emergency petition for temporary orders regarding asset division and protection. Ms. Goldstein, please present your client's position." Patricia rose with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, this is a case requiring immediate intervention to preserve marital assets at risk of dissipation or concealment. My client, Alexandra Vega, discovered approximately 6 months ago that her husband of 20 years, James Rothwell, had been systematically transferring substantial funds to offshore accounts without her knowledge or consent." She proceeded to outline the evidence we had gathered, the Cayman account transfers, the property inquiries in Singapore predating any official job offer, the documented timeline of James's relationship with Melissa Carter. Patricia presented these facts without emotional embellishment, allowing their cumulative weight to establish a clear pattern of deceptive behavior. Furthermore, she continued, Mr. Rothwell publicly announced the end of their marriage at their 20th anniversary celebration just 2 days ago, revealing plans to relocate to Singapore with his paramour. When Ms. Vega took protective action regarding certain assets, Mr. Rothwell attempted unauthorized removal of valuable items from their shared residence, resulting in police intervention. Judge Ramirez turned her penetrating gaze to Marcus. "Counselor, your response?" Marcus Fitzgerald stood, adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture I'd noticed during previous encounters at social events. His specialty was mergers and acquisitions, not family law, and his discomfort in this setting was evident despite his attempt at confidence. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges that communication regarding the marital transition could have been handled more effectively," he began, employing the corporate euphemisms that came naturally to him. "However, the emergency petition significantly mischaracterizes both Mr. Rothwell's intentions and actions. He attempted to reframe James's financial maneuvers as standard tax planning and career preparation rather than asset concealment. The Cayman account was portrayed as a legitimate investment vehicle that would have eventually benefited both parties. The Singapore property inquiries were characterized as preliminary research that any prudent executive would undertake when considering an international position. Throughout this presentation, I observed James's expression, the slight nod when Marcus hit points they had clearly rehearsed, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when particularly damaging evidence was minimized rather than refuted. These micro-expressions had once been invisible to me. Now they read like clear text, revealing the strategic calculations behind his composed exterior. When Marcus addressed the Shelby sale, describing it as a vindictive action designed to cause emotional distress rather than financial protection, I noticed Judge Ramirez's slight raise of eyebrow, the first indication of her perspective on the proceedings. After both attorneys had presented their positions, the judge reviewed the submitted documentation in silence, occasionally looking up to study both James and me with equal intensity. The courtroom remained hushed, the only sounds the occasional shuffle of papers and muted cough from spectators in the gallery. "Mr. Rothwell," Judge Ramirez finally said, her direct address surprising everyone in the courtroom. "Would you explain why you began transferring funds to the Cayman account 11 months ago, well before any potential Singapore position was discussed?" James straightened, clearly unprepared for direct questioning. He glanced at Marcus, who nodded slightly. "Your Honor, international positions have been part of my long-term career planning for several years," James replied, his voice carrying the smooth confidence that had closed countless deals. The account was established as preparation for eventual expatriate status, with no intent to deprive Ms. Vega of equitable distribution. Judge Ramirez's expression remained impassive. "And the timing of your announcement at your anniversary dinner, was that also part of long-term planning?" A slight flush appeared at James's collar. The timing was admittedly unfortunate. Emotions were running high, and I made a poor decision regarding the appropriate setting for such a discussion. "A discussion implies exchange between parties," Judge Ramirez observed. "Based on the submitted statements, you made a unilateral announcement without prior private communication with your wife. Is that accurate?" James shifted slightly in his seat. "I believed Ms. Vega was aware of the growing distance in our marriage. The formal announcement was perhaps abrupt, but the underlying reality was not new." His ability to reframe reality to suit his narrative remained impressive, even as I recognized the manipulation inherent in his response. The growing distance he referenced had been entirely of his creation, constructed to justify decisions already made rather than reflecting mutual evolution of the relationship. After additional questioning of both James and me, Judge Ramirez delivered her ruling with decisive clarity. "Based on the evidence presented, I am granting the emergency orders as requested. All marital assets will remain frozen pending comprehensive financial disclosure and formal division. Mr. Rothwell is prohibited from removing any items from the marital residence without prior written agreement or court approval. Both parties are restrained from disposing of any marital property outside normal daily expenses, which shall be documented." She fixed James with a pointed look. "Mr. Rothwell, let me be absolutely clear. The pattern of financial activity preceding your announcement represents precisely the behavior these emergency provisions are designed to prevent. Any further attempts to circumvent full disclosure or equitable distribution will be viewed extremely unfavorably by this court." Turning. To me, her expression remained equally stern. "Ms. Vega, while the sale of the vehicle was within your legal rights given joint titling, this court expects both parties to maintain the status quo regarding remaining assets going forward. Your attorney can advise you on proper procedures for any necessary transactions during these proceedings." With a final instruction regarding filing deadlines for comprehensive financial disclosure, Judge Ramirez concluded the hearing and moved on to her next case, leaving James visibly shaken by the outcome. His usual confidence had crumbled under direct questioning and unambiguous accountability. As we gathered our materials to leave, I felt neither vindication nor satisfaction, only a calm certainty that proper boundaries had been established. This wasn't about punishing James or extracting revenge, but about creating the conditions for equitable resolution and personal reconstruction. Outside the courthouse, Patricia allowed herself a small smile of professional satisfaction. That went precisely as it should have. Judge Ramirez has a particular dislike for financial manipulation in divorce cases. Having her assigned to our hearing was remarkably fortunate. "What happens next?" I asked as we descended the courthouse steps. "James and Marcus have 20 days to provide comprehensive financial disclosure. Every account, property, investment, retirement fund, everything. Given yesterday's incident and today's ruling, I expect they'll comply fully rather than risking further judicial disapproval." She checked her watch. "I have another client meeting in 30 minutes. Are you comfortable heading back on your own? We can arrange a car if you prefer." "I'll walk," I decided. "The fresh air will help me process everything that's happened." Patricia squeezed my arm supportively. "You were excellent in there, Alex. Composed, direct, authentic. Judges notice those qualities, especially in high-asset cases where emotional displays often obscure the substantive issues." As she departed, I remained on the courthouse steps, watching the flow of humanity moving through this nexus of life transitions. Marriages being formalized in one department while being dissolved in another, property changing hands, custody being determined, names being changed. So many personal watersheds concentrated in one institutional space. My phone vibrated with an incoming call, Elena confirming our dinner plans for that evening. We arranged to meet at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, far from the Upper East Side venues where we might encounter acquaintances from my marriage circuitry. I began walking uptown, deliberately taking side streets rather than main avenues. The morning's proceedings had established essential protective parameters, but they represented only the external structure for the more personal reconstruction I was undertaking. The legal dissolution of my marriage would proceed according to established protocols and timelines. The internal recalibration of my identity would follow no such predictable path. For 20 years, I had been Alexandra Rothwell, corporate, wife, perfect hostess, supportive partner. These roles had never been explicitly imposed. Rather, they had accumulated through countless small adjustments, accommodations, and prioritizations. James's preferences became our preferences. His professional needs structured our shared schedule. His social connections determined our community. The progressive submersion of my independent identity had been so gradual as to be nearly imperceptible, like water slowly rising around a stationary object. Now, with those external definitions suddenly removed, I was confronting fundamental questions about who Alexandra Vega actually was beneath the accumulated layers of adaptation. What did I genuinely enjoy, independent of social positioning or others' expectations? What capacities had remained dormant during my marriage that might now be reactivated? What new aspects of myself might emerge when not constrained by established patterns? These questions accompanied me as I walked through neighborhoods I rarely visited, observing interactions, architecture, and activities with fresh perspective. By the time I reached the Surrey Hotel, I felt both physically energized and mentally clarified by the combination of movement and reflection. In my suite, I found an arrangement of white calla lilies with a note from Elena. "For new beginnings. Looking forward to tonight." My sister's intuitive understanding of exactly what I needed in this moment, not sympathy or outrage, but simple acknowledgement of transition and possibility, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I spent the afternoon in practical tasks, coordinating with Patricia's office regarding documentation, researching financial advisors specializing in post-divorce wealth management, exploring residential options beyond the hotel. These concrete activities provided structure while deeper processing continued beneath conscious thought. By early evening, I was ready for my dinner with Elena. I chose an outfit different from anything in my previous wardrobe rotation, a simple black jumpsuit with architectural lines that emphasized strength rather than conventional femininity. With minimal jewelry and low-heeled boots rather than my usual stilettos, I presented a visual declaration of my evolving self-conception. The restaurant Elena had selected was exactly right for our conversation. Intimate enough for private discussion, but lively enough to create ambient privacy. When I arrived, she was already seated in a corner booth, her filmmaker's eye having chosen the perfect vantage point for both conversation and people watching. She stood to embrace me, holding the hug longer than usual. "You look different," she said, studying me as we sat down. "It's not just the outfit. There's something in your posture, your energy." "I feel different," I acknowledged, accepting the glass of Barolo she had already ordered for me. "Like I'm occupying my full space for the first time in years." This observation emerged spontaneously, crystallizing something I had been feeling, but hadn't yet articulated. Throughout my marriage, I had gradually constricted, physically, vocally, energetically, to complement rather than compete with James's expansive presence. The contraction had been so incremental that I hadn't recognized it until experiencing its release. Elena nodded, understanding immediately. "You were always dimming your light around him. We all saw it happening, but whenever anyone mentioned it, you had perfectly reasonable explanations for why your career was on hold, or your opinions had shifted, or your personal style had changed. Her directness might once have triggered defensiveness. Now it simply felt clarifying. The most effective cage is one you don't recognize you're in," I said, "especially when you've participated in building it. That's remarkably insightful for someone only 48 hours into freedom," Elena observed, her expression both impressed and concerned. "But I hope you're allowing yourself to feel everything, not just intellectualizing the experience." The question was valid. My capacity for emotional containment, initially developed in our achievement-oriented family and subsequently reinforced throughout my marriage, had served me well during investigation and preparation. But that same containment could potentially limit full processing and genuine renewal if maintained indefinitely. "I'm working on balance," I told her. "Lillian has been helpful with that, creating space for emotional acknowledgement without becoming overwhelmed by it." As our first courses arrived, I shared more details about the discoveries of the past 6 months, the strategic planning with Patricia, and the emergency hearing that morning. Elena listened intently, asking occasional questions but primarily allowing me to articulate the journey in my own words. "The thing that strikes me most," she said when I had finished, "is how thoroughly James underestimated you. He seems to have genuinely believed you'd be blindsided and disoriented by his announcement." "He forgot who I was before we met," I replied. "Or perhaps he never fully saw me to begin with. I was always more function than person to him. First, as validation of his desirability, then as enhancement of his professional image, finally as infrastructure for his daily life." This assessment emerged without bitterness, simply recognition of a fundamental emptiness at the core of our connection. What I had experienced as progressive diminishment, James likely perceived as natural evolution of our respective roles, his expanding while mine contracted in complementary fashion. "Have you decided what to do about Melissa's email?" Elena asked, bringing me back to more immediate concerns. I had shared the unexpected communication with both Elena and Patricia, uncertain about the appropriate response. Patricia had advised caution from a legal perspective, noting that any communication could potentially be used in proceedings. Elena, characteristically, was more interested in the human dynamics and potential revelations. "I'm still considering it," I said. "Her claim that James wasn't honest with either of us is intriguing. What could he possibly have misrepresented to both his wife and his affair partner?" "Only one way to find out," Elena pointed out, her natural curiosity evident. "And information is power in your current situation." After further discussion weighing potential benefits against risks, I made my decision. "I'll contact her, but with clear boundaries. A single conversation, no ongoing communication, and complete transparency with Patricia about anything relevant to legal proceedings. Elena nodded approval. Just be prepared for emotional complexity. Whatever her motivations for reaching out, this won't be a straightforward exchange of information. As our main courses arrived, conversation shifted to more forward-looking topics: potential living arrangements, professional re-engagement, social recalibration. Elena's perspective as someone who had known me before and throughout my marriage provided valuable continuity as I considered these transitions. You know, she said thoughtfully, this apartment building in my neighborhood just completed renovation. The top floor has this incredible corner unit with terrace space. It's nothing like your Central Park West Palace, but it has amazing light. For someone who spent 2 decades in those dark, masculine rooms James preferred. The suggestion activated immediate interest, not just in the specific property, but in the radical shift it represented. Moving from the Upper West Side to Elena's, Greenwich Village neighborhood would constitute a clear demarcation between my married life and whatever came next. The different architectural style, neighborhood culture, and daily patterns would support internal changes with external realignment. I'd like to see it, I decided. Not with commitment, just exploration. Elena smiled. That's exactly the right approach for everything right now, isn't it? Exploration without immediate commitment. Seeing possibilities without pressure to choose definitively. Her framing resonated deeply. After decades of progressive constriction into predetermined roles and expectations, I was entering a phase of expansion and discovery. Each decision, from residence to professional engagement to personal style, could be approached as exploration rather than permanent definition. As we shared dessert, Elena asked the question that had been underlying much of our conversation. Are you scared at all? About any of this? The query invited honest reflection rather than performance of confidence. I considered it carefully, looking beyond intellectual understanding to emotional truth. Not scared of practical challenges, I said slowly. The financial aspects, legal proceedings, even rebuilding professional connections, those feel manageable. What occasionally unnerves me is the sheer openness ahead. After decades of defined identity and prescribed patterns, the freedom to determine my own direction feels simultaneously exhilarating and daunting. Elena reached across the table to squeeze my hand. That's the most human thing you've said, all evening, and probably the healthiest response possible to your situation. As we walked together after dinner, arm in arm through village streets illuminated by restaurant windows and vintage street lamps, I felt a deepening appreciation for continuity amidst disruption. While my marriage was ending, other connections remained intact, not just surviving, but potentially thriving with new authenticity, once freed from accommodation to James's preferences and judgments. I'll set up a viewing of that apartment, Elena said as we prepared to part ways, she toward her brownstone, I toward a taxi back to the Surrey. No pressure, just exploration. Perfect, I agreed, embracing her with genuine gratitude for her presence in this transitional landscape. Back in my hotel suite, I made a decision about Melissa's email, composing a brief, clear response. Melissa, I'm willing to speak once, by phone rather than email, with the understanding that any information relevant to legal proceedings will be shared with my attorney. If these terms are acceptable, I'm available tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Alexandra Vega. The response was neither emotional nor unnecessarily formal, simply direct and boundaried. Whether Melissa accepted these terms or not, I had maintained agency in the interaction rather than being pulled into someone else's communication framework. As I prepared for sleep, I reflected on the day's progression from courtroom confrontation to private connection with Elena to this potential conversation with Melissa. Each represented a different facet of the reconstruction I was undertaking, legal, personal, and informational. The process reminded me of kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold, creating something more valuable and unique through acknowledgement rather than concealment of damage. My marriage had fractured irreparably, but the reconstruction process need not simply restore what was. Instead, it could incorporate the reality of breakage into a new formation more authentic and reflective of genuine value than what had been lost. This metaphor felt right as I drifted toward sleep, not minimizing the pain of betrayal and dissolution, but recognizing potential for beauty in the reconstitution that followed. Not despite the breakage, but because of how it was acknowledged and integrated into whatever emerged next. My name is Alexandra Vega. I am 46 years old, and I am reclaiming not just my name, but the right to define what that name will come to represent. Melissa Carter agreed to my terms for our conversation, with surprising immediacy. Her response arrived in my inbox less than 20 minutes after I sent mine, accepting the proposed time and providing her phone number. The lack of negotiation or clarification suggested urgency on her part, something beyond mere curiosity or obligation driving her desire to speak with me. I spent the morning of our scheduled call viewing the Greenwich Village apartment Elena had mentioned. The building, a former industrial space converted to luxury residences, retained architectural elements from its original purpose: exposed brick walls, expansive windows, soaring ceilings, while incorporating contemporary amenities and finishes. The corner unit on the top floor featured a wraparound terrace with views of both the city skyline and Hudson River. The previous owners commissioned Aurelio Martinez for the renovation, the real estate agent explained as we moved through the space. He preserved the industrial bones while creating livable, intimate spaces within the larger volume. The design struck me immediately as the antithesis of our Central Park West apartment, where James had insisted on sleek, masculine minimalism punctuated by strategic status objects. The Eames chair positioned perfectly for visitors to notice, the limited edition art books arranged precisely on the coffee table, the vintage Macallan displayed behind glass in the dining room. Those spaces had been curated for impression rather than experience, each element calculated for its visual communication of success and sophistication. This apartment, by contrast, felt designed for genuine living, the kitchen oriented to facilitate actual cooking rather than catered events, the living areas arranged for conversation rather than presentation, the primary bedroom positioned to capture morning light rather than showcase a prestigious address. The terrace, with its carefully selected plantings and comfortable seating, invited lingering rather than strategic entertaining. "It's been on the market just 3 days," the agent noted as we completed the tour. "Given the location and unique features, I don't expect it will remain available long." I thanked her for the showing, promising to be in touch soon regarding my interest. As I departed, I found myself genuinely attracted to the space in a way that surprised me. It wasn't simply that the apartment was beautiful or well-designed, but that it represented a completely different approach to home, one centered on authentic experience rather than external validation. Back at the Surrey, I prepared for my call with Melissa, with the same focused attention I had once given to preparing for high-stakes client meetings in my brief career before marriage. I created a mental framework for the conversation. Key: questions to prioritize, boundaries to maintain, information to seek, while remaining open to unexpected revelations or directions. At precisely 2 o'clock, I initiated the call. Melissa answered immediately, as though she had been waiting with phone in hand. "Alexandra," she said, her British accent more pronounced than I had expected based on our brief encounter at a corporate function months earlier. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I'm interested in understanding what James misrepresented to both of us," I replied, bypassing social preliminaries in favor of directness. "You mentioned in your email that there are aspects of the situation that won't emerge through legal channels." "Yes," Melissa confirmed, "though I'm realizing now how difficult this conversation will be." A pause, then. "I should begin by apologizing. My relationship with James was inexcusable regardless of what I believed about your marriage. The acknowledgement was unexpected. Based on James's public announcement and private communications, I had assumed Melissa was a willing participant in the narrative he had constructed, that their relationship represented authentic connection, that their shared future in Singapore was a natural progression for two aligned professionals, that their union was somehow less morally problematic because my marriage to James had supposedly run its course. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "But I'm more interested in understanding what James told you about our marriage and your future together that wasn't accurate." Melissa took an audible breath. "Everything, essentially. He told me you and he had been separated for over a year, living essentially independent lives while maintaining appearances for professional reasons. He claimed you had both agreed to formalize the divorce once he secured an international position that would make the transition less socially complicated in your circles. This version aligned with what James had attempted to convey at our anniversary dinner, the narrative of mutual agreement and amicable separation rather than unilateral betrayal. What surprised me was not the content of his deception, but its completeness. He hadn't simply minimized an ongoing marriage, but fabricated an entirely fictional separation. "When did your relationship begin?" I asked, seeking to establish a timeline against which to measure his other deceptions. 14 months ago, Melissa replied without hesitation. "During the London office expansion project, James was there for 6 weeks overseeing integration of the acquired firm. We worked closely on regulatory compliance issues. This timing aligned with my discovered financial irregularities, which had begun approximately 11 months ago. The relationship had preceded the financial maneuvers, perhaps even motivating them as James began contemplating a different future than the key, one we ostensibly shared." "And the Singapore position?" I prompted. "When did that possibility emerge?" "That's where things become particularly complicated," Melissa said, her tone shifting from apologetic to something harder. "The Singapore office was my project initially. I developed the expansion proposal, secured preliminary regulatory approvals, and built relationships with potential Asian partners over 2 years." She paused, and I could hear the controlled anger beneath her professional composure. "James expressed interest in the project about 8 months ago, offering to mentor me through the final approval process. Given his seniority and connections, I welcomed his involvement initially. By 4 months ago, he had effectively repositioned himself as the lead on the initiative, with me as his lieutenant rather than the originator." The timeline she described corresponded precisely with James's increased travel to London and his growing focus on Asian markets in his conversations with colleagues and clients. What I had interpreted as legitimate business development had actually been strategic repositioning to capitalize on Melissa's groundwork. "So his announcement about leading the Singapore office," I began, "was the culmination of a careful campaign to claim my project as his own," Melissa finished. "When the executive committee formally approved the expansion last month, the leadership role was assigned to James, based largely on materials and relationships I had developed, but he had gradually assumed credit for. This pattern was painfully familiar. Throughout his career, James had demonstrated remarkable skill at identifying promising initiatives, inserting himself strategically, and ultimately emerging as the recognized authority, often edging out the original champions in the process. I had witnessed this dynamic repeatedly with colleagues and competitors, never imagining I would one day compare notes with his lover about the same technique applied to both professional and personal spheres. "What changed?" I asked. "Your email mentioned returning to London rather than proceeding to Singapore." "2 things," Melissa said. "First, witnessing his behavior at your anniversary dinner. The James I thought I knew would never have created such a public spectacle, regardless of circumstances. It seemed gratuitously cruel in a way that made me question everything about his character." She continued after a brief pause. "Second, discovering through office communications that he had already begun interviewing candidates for what was supposed to be my deputy position in Singapore. He was effectively eliminating me from the project entirely, both professionally and personally. The comprehensive nature of James's duplicity was breathtaking, constructing entirely separate narratives for his wife, his lover, and his colleagues, each carefully calibrated to advance his interests without regard for the humans involved. Not compartmentalization, but complete instrumentalization of every relationship. "Have you spoken with him since the dinner?" I asked. "He's called repeatedly," Melissa confirmed. "I've maintained minimal communication, citing need for space to process. In reality, I've been documenting everything: emails, text messages, meeting notes, and sharing them with both HR and the executive committee." Her proactive approach indicated professional savvy I hadn't anticipated. "What outcome do you expect from that disclosure?" "At minimum, reconsideration of the Singapore leadership assignment," she said firmly. "Ideally, recognition of the ethical breaches involved in how the situation developed. The firm has clear policies regarding disclosure of personal relationships when they intersect with reporting structures or advancement opportunities. I considered this information carefully, assessing its implications for both my legal proceedings and my broader understanding of James's character and actions. The professional dimension added contextual depth to what I had already discovered about his personal deceptions. "Thank you for sharing this," I said finally. "It confirms certain patterns I've observed throughout our marriage, but extends them in ways I hadn't fully recognized." "There's one more thing," Melissa said, her voice dropping slightly. "Something you should be aware of regarding the financial aspects of your situation." This captured my full attention. Despite our thorough investigation, Patricia had acknowledged that James's financial acumen might have enabled him to conceal certain assets or arrangements beyond what we had discovered. "James mentioned a pre-IPO investment opportunity approximately 5 months ago," Melissa continued. "A Singapore-based financial technology company preparing for public offering. He described using personal funds for a significant early position that he anticipated would generate extraordinary returns within the year." This was entirely new information. Neither Patricia's investigation nor the forensic accountant had uncovered any such investment, which suggested it might be held through particularly obscure channels or under alternative identification. "Did he mention the company name or any specific details?" I asked, maintaining neutral tone despite my intense interest. "Quantum Meridian Technology," Melissa replied. "He described it as potentially transformative for digital banking in emerging markets. He was unusually excited about it, said he had leveraged significant resources to maximize his position." I made careful note of this information, which would require immediate follow-up with Patricia and our financial investigators. If James had indeed committed substantial marital assets to this investment without disclosure, it would constitute exactly the kind of financial misconduct our emergency orders were designed to prevent. "This is valuable information," I acknowledged. "May I ask why you're sharing it with me?" "Beyond general ethical considerations." Melissa was silent for a moment. "Partly accountability for my role in a situation that caused you significant pain, but also recognition that professional women, regardless of our specific circumstances, face similar dynamics in both corporate and personal spheres. The techniques James used to appropriate my work and manipulate our relationship echo patterns I've observed throughout my career." Her perspective resonated unexpectedly. Despite the obvious differences in our positions, we had both experienced the particular form of erasure that occurs when competent women's contributions, boundaries, and autonomy are systematically subordinated to a man's narrative and objectives. "I appreciate your candor," I said, "and I'll ensure this information is appropriately addressed through legal channels." "That's all I ask," Melissa replied. "I should mention I've accepted a position with a different firm in London, effective immediately. I won't be proceeding with any aspect of the Singapore initiative." After concluding the call, I immediately contacted Patricia to relay the information about quantum meridian technology and the additional context regarding James's professional maneuvering. She responded with characteristic efficiency, promising to initiate investigation into the undisclosed investment immediately. "This is exactly the kind of specific lead we need," she noted. "Pre-IPO investments often involve complex ownership structures designed to maximize confidentiality. Without the company name, we might never have identified this particular asset." With this essential task addressed, I returned to contemplation of the Greenwich Village apartment. The conversation with Melissa had crystallized something important about my current transition, the opportunity to restructure not just legal and financial arrangements, but fundamental patterns of engagement with spaces, relationships, and identity itself. The Central Park West apartment, with its calculated presentation of success and sophistication, represented the culmination of James's particular approach to life, prioritizing appearance over substance, impression over experience, acquisition over connection. Remaining in that space, even with full legal title, would mean continuing to inhabit the physical manifestation of values I was actively questioning. The village apartment, by contrast, represented possibility, architectural, elements from the past preserved and integrated into new configurations, original features revealed rather than concealed beneath superficial coverings, authentic materials celebrated rather than replaced with more prestigious alternatives. A space of transformation rather than transaction. I contacted the real estate agent and arranged to submit an offer that afternoon, not from emotional impulse, but from recognition of alignment between the space and my emerging priorities. Whether this specific property became my next home or not, the decisiveness of action represented an important shift from reactive to generative engagement with my circumstances. That evening, I met with Lillian Chen for our regular therapy session, having accumulated significant material for processing since our last conversation. I shared the court outcomes, the conversation with Melissa, and my decision to pursue the Greenwich Village apartment, seeking her perspective on how these external developments reflected and influenced my internal journey. "What strikes me most in everything you've shared," Lillian observed, "is the transition from information gathering to active creation. For months, you've been primarily in discovery mode, uncovering James's deceptions, documenting financial maneuvers, preparing protective responses. Now you're beginning to generate new possibilities rather than simply responding to revealed problems." This framing illuminated something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. The investigative phase had been necessary, but inherently reactive, focused on understanding what was rather than envisioning what could be. The shift toward creation, selecting a new home, considering professional re-engagement, establishing different patterns of relationship, represented a fundamental change in orientation. I'm also noticing how your natural analytical abilities, which served you well during the investigation phase, are now being complemented by increasing trust in your intuitive responses. Lillian continued. Your decision about the apartment wasn't just logically sound, but felt right at a deeper level. This observation touched on something more challenging, my long-established pattern of privileging rational analysis over emotional or intuitive and knowing. Throughout my marriage, this hierarchy had been reinforced by James's particular blend of dismissiveness and manipulation whenever I expressed intuitive concerns about his behaviors or decisions. The gradual erosion of trust in my own perceptions had constituted one of the more insidious aspects of our dynamic. The conversation with Melissa seems particularly significant, Lillian noted, not just for the practical information it provided, but for the perspective it offered on patterns that transcend your specific situation with James. This resonated strongly. Despite the obvious differences in our positions, the parallels between how James had treated Melissa professionally and how he had treated me personally revealed consistent patterns of exploitation beneath varying contexts. His fundamental approach to relationships, extracting maximum value while minimizing authentic reciprocity, had simply manifested in different forms across different spheres. What's emerging for me, I shared, is recognition that rebuilding isn't simply about establishing new external arrangements, residence, finances, social connections. It's about reconstructing my relationship with my own perceptions and experiences, trusting what I observe and feel rather than automatically subordinating my understanding to someone else's narrative. Lillian nodded. That's profound integration of external and internal work. The legal proceedings address necessary practical dimensions, but this reclamation of your own authority over your experience represents the deeper transformation. As our session concluded, I felt a growing sense of coherence between various aspects of my unfolding journey. The practical steps, legal protection, financial disentanglement, residential relocation, were progressing in alignment with, rather than separation from, the internal work of recalibrating fundamental patterns of perception, valuation, and engagement. Back at the Surrey, I found a message from the real estate agent. My offer on the Greenwich Village apartment had been accepted. The owners, impressed by the clean terms and absence of contingencies, had selected my proposal over two competing bids received the same day. With typical closing timelines, I could take possession within 30 days. This concrete development triggered both practical considerations and deeper reflection. The apartment would require furnishing that reflected my emerging aesthetic rather than James's prescribed minimalism or the formal traditionalism of our shared homes. This necessity represented both challenge and opportunity, the chance to select surroundings based on authentic preference rather than strategic impression. I began creating notes about elements that felt important for my new space: natural materials, textural variety, spaces configured for actual use rather than display, authentic art selected for resonance rather than investment potential or status signaling. The process felt simultaneously trivial and profound. Selecting furnishings was hardly life's most significant decision. Yet the opportunity to create environment based on genuine preference rather than performative considerations represented meaningful reclamation. As midnight approached, I received another email from Patricia with preliminary findings regarding quantum meridian technology. The forensic accountant had already identified a complex ownership structure involving a Cayman Islands holding company with connections to a Singapore-based investment vehicle. While definitive confirmation of James's involvement would require additional investigation, initial indicators strongly suggested we had indeed located a significant undisclosed asset. If confirmed, Patricia noted, this discovery will substantially strengthen our position regarding financial misconduct and potentially lead to more favorable division of identified assets. The judge has already expressed concern about James's pattern of concealment. Concrete evidence of additional hidden investments would further validate those concerns. This development reinforced the value of my conversation with Melissa, despite its emotional complexity. Information was indeed power in my current circumstances, not for purposes of revenge or punishment, but for ensuring equitable resolution based on complete rather than selectively presented reality. As I prepared for sleep, I found myself contemplating the multi-layered nature of revelation occurring in my life. External revelations, James's betrayal, his financial deceptions, his professional manipulations, had initially dominated my attention. Yet these were progressively being balanced by internal revelations, recognition of my own strength, recovery of subordinated capacities, recalibration of fundamental values and priorities. Both types of revelation served essential functions in my transformation. External revelations had disrupted unsustainable patterns and created necessary separation from destructive dynamics. Internal revelations were gradually reconstructing my relationship with myself and my engagement with the world on more authentic terms. Tomorrow would bring continued progress on practical fronts. legal proceedings, financial investigations, residential preparations. But the deeper work would continue in parallel. The progressive reclamation of authority over my own experience, the reconstruction of relationship with my perceptions and preferences, the gradual revelation of who Alexandra Vega might become when not defined primarily through someone else's narrative or needs. My name is Alexandra Vega. I am 46 years old. And I am discovering that revelation, while often painful in its initial impact, contains the seeds of genuine renewal when approached with clarity, courage, and compassion for the self that is emerging through the process. The morning after receiving confirmation of my accepted offer on the Greenwich Village apartment, I woke with a sense of purposeful energy, unlike anything I'd experienced in months. This wasn't the vigilant focus that had characterized my investigation phase, or the controlled composure I'd maintained through legal proceedings. Instead, it was a generative momentum, the feeling of building something new rather than simply responding to what had been dismantled. I began my day with a call to a real estate attorney Patricia had recommended, someone independent from our divorce proceedings who could manage the purchase transaction efficiently. Within an hour, necessary documents were being prepared, financial arrangements initiated, and a closing date tentatively scheduled for 28 days hence. My next call was to Elena, sharing the news about the apartment. Her excitement mirrored my own, but in characteristically practical fashion, she immediately shifted to implementation questions. "Have you thought about what you'll bring from the Central Park West place?" she asked. "Or are you starting completely fresh?" The question crystallized something I'd been considering subconsciously. Mostly fresh, I decided. There are specific items with personal significance, photographs, books, my grandmother's sapphire earrings that match her ring. But the furniture and decorative elements were selected to create a particular impression rather than reflect genuine preference. "So, a nearly blank slate," Elena observed. "That's simultaneously liberating and daunting." She was right. The prospect of selecting every element of my new environment offered tremendous freedom, but also required clear discernment about what I actually wanted versus what I had been conditioned to choose. After decades of calibrating selections to James's preferences or social positioning, how would I recognize and trust my authentic aesthetic responses? "I have a suggestion," Elena offered. "My friend Meera Patel, you met her at my gallery opening last year. She's an interior designer who specializes in working with clients in transition. Not just physical transitions, but identity transitions. Her approach is more facilitative than prescriptive." The recommendation resonated immediately. Having assistance with the technical aspects of creating a cohesive living space would be valuable. But even more important was working with someone who understood the deeper dimensions of what this transition represented. "Would you introduce us?" I asked. Within hours, Elena had arranged a preliminary meeting for the following day. This efficient progress on practical matters created space for addressing the more complex information that had emerged from my conversation with Melissa. Patricia called mid-morning with an update on the quantum meridian technology investigation. "The forensic accountant has confirmed James's investment," she reported. "Approximately $2 million channeled through 3 separate entities to obscure the connection to marital assets. The trail leads back to liquidated investments from your joint portfolio, with transactions carefully structured to appear unrelated. The amount was substantial even within our overall financial picture, representing nearly 8% of our liquid assets. More significant than the dollar value, however, was the deliberate concealment it represented. These weren't impulsive withdrawals, but carefully orchestrated transfers designed specifically to shield assets from equitable division. This strengthens our position considerably," Patricia continued. "We now have documented evidence of both infidelity and financial misconduct, the 2 strongest factors for favorable asset division under New York law. Judge Ramirez has already demonstrated her disapproval of James's actions. This additional revelation will further impact her assessment. We discussed next steps, filing amended disclosures reflecting the discovered investment, potentially requesting additional emergency orders regarding specifically identified hidden assets, and preparing for formal settlement negotiations from a position of increased leverage. "There's one more development you should be aware of," Patricia added before concluding our call. "James has replaced Marcus Fitzgerald with Catherine Delaney as his divorce attorney." This shift was significant. Catherine Delaney was among New York's most formidable family law practitioners, known for aggressive advocacy and strategic sophistication. Unlike Marcus, whose corporate expertise translated poorly to matrimonial proceedings, Catherine would bring specialized knowledge and tactical precision to James's case. "What does this mean for our approach?" I asked, recognizing the potential implications for both process and outcomes. "Two possibilities," Patricia replied thoughtfully. "Either James is preparing for prolonged, high-conflict litigation, which would be Catherine's natural wheelhouse, or he's bringing in someone with sufficient expertise to negotiate a reasonable settlement once he recognizes his position has been compromised by his own actions." She continued after a brief pause. "My instinct leans toward the latter. The evidence of financial misconduct is too substantial to overcome through even the most aggressive litigation. Catherine is too skilled to waste client resources on unwinnable positions. I suspect she'll counsel James toward strategic concession rather than prolonged battle." This assessment aligned with my own reading of the situation. Despite his emotional reactions at the precinct and his threatening messages, James was fundamentally rational in professional contexts. Once he recognized the legal and financial realities created by his own actions, he would likely pivot toward damage control rather than continuing a self-defeating campaign. With these legal matters addressed for the moment, I turned to another aspect of my reinvention process: professional re-engagement. My financial security was assured regardless of specific employment, given my share of marital assets and investments. But meaningful work had always been central to my sense of self, and its progressive diminishment during my marriage had constituted a significant loss. Before marriage, I had been pursuing a promising career in financial analysis with particular focus on market entry strategies for expanding firms. My academic background in both finance and international business had positioned me well for this specialization, and I had demonstrated particular talent for identifying overlooked opportunities in emerging markets. When I set this path aside to support James's career advancement, the decision had been framed as temporary, a strategic pause rather than permanent abandonment. Yet, as his professional trajectory accelerated, mine had receded further into the background, gradually transforming from deferred priority to abandoned identity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.